Because right now, everybody's street niggas.
I'm a street nigga, bro.
You wasn't no street nigga.
But if you're a real street nigga,
I'm a street nigga.
What kind of street nigga are you then?
A real street nigga, man.
Well, like it used to be. That shit ceased to be really in the late 60s, early 70s.
A junkie walking through the twilight. I'm on my way home. I left 3 days ago, but no one seems to know I'm gone. Home is where the hatred is. Home is filled with pain, and it might not be such a bad idea if I never went home again.
Nothing they could ask for is too much.
Like that, but I'm just showing you how it is. You know, that's what these people, these dudes, like the dude that was standing up in the middle of the yard hollering and stuff like that. That's what he was hollering about. He was hollering at the world. You know what I'm saying? You know,
If they say send a jet, put it on the top of the roof, I suggest that y'all do it. Because I know in all sincerity, and knowing my brother the way that I do, I know he'll do whatever he said he'll do if they don't get it.
Because his life is, he died. You know, that dude upstairs is hollering out the window. He's dying. I'm talking to you on this, in front of this camera. I'm dying.
Death is a holy and a part of the gift of life. It is God's way of gathering his family to himself. Our death in sin is certainly to be feared. But
the Vietnam War was still active. Some soldiers never made it back. Some came back with new habits. And no one seemed to know the real reason we were there. This period in time was an all-around circus. People was tired of it, ready for it to end. And the same with racism. You could see the aftermath of the '68 Dr. King riots well into the early '70s. Old burned buildings were boarded up, still standing. The few years following the riot, the murder rate went up. And matter of fact, crime in general rose. And the poverty level increased even after that.
We can't sit back and say we're never going to do anything about crime until we do something about poverty and unemployment and racial discrimination.
The same year Dr. King was assassinated, some neighborhoods that became well known and vicious later were just being completed. Montana Terrace, Potomac Gardens, Sursum Quarter, 1968, just to name a few. As the first families moved in, I bet it didn't cross their minds that the neighborhood would become notorious for crime later.
Hello?
Can somebody tell me?
Larceny, the manager refuses to make a report.
Young girls couldn't walk the streets alone back in the early 70s in D.C., not without paranoia, because some man was terrorizing the community, snatching up 6 black girls between the ages of 10 and 18 in 1971 and 1972, doing the unthinkable before taking their lives and leaving their bodies around town. He antagonized the feds and the media saying, "Catch me if you can," while he specifically targeted girls in D.C.
Yeah, it's solvable.
49 years after the Freeway Phantom hunted girls on the streets near St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Blaine Pardo and Victoria Hester, a father-daughter writing team, are convinced someone could still find a key piece of evidence that will lead police to the killer.
He kept textbooks from one of the girls. He kept hair curlers from another girl. He kept shoelaces from another girl. Some family member may stumble across those things and say, why did he keep this junk?
April 25th, 1971, 13-year-old Carol Spinks went out to buy groceries. 6 days later, police found her body dumped along I-295. Barefoot, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her twin sister still talks to her every day.
You know, basically, I just say that I hope she's okay. I'm sure she is.
Like the flowers need the rain, like a blind man needs a cane. I need you. Like the darkness needs night, and the moon glow needs a light. I need you. Like the children need to play, they laugh and sing from day to day.
The decline in the black community was evident at this point. More crime, more addicts, more people roaming the streets figuring it out day by day. Times were changing. A decade before, in 1960, we had one of the highest marriage rates. 2 out of every 3 black children came from a 2-parent household. The family structure was present for the most part. We all had our roles. Men were men and women were women, and we struggled together, figuring it out together. But by the 1970s, years after the Great Society plan, we saw the most dramatic decline in marriage in the black community and an increase in divorce and separation. Most people barely kept their heads above water. Of course, we always had a middle class sprinkled in and families that remained intact. It just wasn't the case for the majority, but places like River Terrace and Northeast, which used to be all white, became that exception. When black folks moved in, white homeowners would write racist stuff on the building walls back in the 1950s. They wanted them gone, but after realizing they wasn't going nowhere, one by one, the majority of white families started moving out. And we kept purchasing homes in that area. We talking senior citizens and middle-class black families. Some of them worked in government. And by the early 1980s, River Terrace was 80% black. It was a different caliber of men running the streets during the 70s. I call the 70s the end of the Underworld Era, simply because some of the most well-known seasoned men from the 60s had already reached their peak in the streets by that point. We cover Isaac Tindall, Carl Kelly, and Vernon Cooper, you know, some of the heroin pushers back in the day. If you haven't watched that video, check that joint out, the Carl Kelly story. Linwood Gray had caught his big case at the end of the 70s, which he beat, but they got him on tax evasion. It really was the end of an era. Plus, with a lot of men gone from the homes, boys turned to the streets, getting involved in everything from petty crimes to more serious cases. These juveniles at the old D.C. jail in the 70s, before they were segregated, were 16 and 17-year-olds, held in the same units as the adults. At this exact time this footage was captured, Nabal, Cadillac Smith L., and the other 6 escapees were free on the streets after breaking out the jail. According to testimonies from inmates and reporters, the jail was deplorable, overcrowded, and just flat out nasty. And so on October 11th, 1972, the men spoke and took COs as hostages after getting the gun in the jail. And everyone from the news crews and local activists showed up. The inmates were demanding that the juveniles be housed separately from adults, better quality food, and much more.
The light of day made clearer the gravity of a situation which began shortly past 2 o'clock this morning. Rioting prisoners seized cell block number 1, burned mattresses, and grabbed 10 hostages, including Washington Department of Corrections Chief Kenneth Hardy.
The same thing happened in the Attica Correctional Facility in New York a year prior, 1971. Inmates took over the whole facility, and 3 years after that, 2 men who was a part of the old DC jail uprising named Frank and Otis. Otis also used the name Robert. These guys in the photo, they took on 7 hostages at the federal court building in the city while they was already facing 70 years for different charges, including armed robbery.
2 convicts still are holding 7 hostages in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C.
Washington's federal courthouse was sealed off yesterday afternoon by hundreds of heavily armed police and federal marshals. 2 convicts had smuggled a gun into the court's basement cell block and were holding 7 hostages and demanding an airplane and safe conduct out of the country. The convicts have been identified as Robert Jones and Frank Gorham. Both face long jail terms for a variety of felonies, including previous escape attempts. The situation remained the same through the night as Jones and Gorham attempted to negotiate their release. This morning, Jones and Gorham opened the cells of other prisoners in the cell block and seized more guns and ammunition.
Nothing they could ask for is too much. If they say send a jet, put it on the top of the roof, I suggest that y'all do it. Because I know in all sincerity, and knowing my brother the way that I do, I know he'll do whatever he said he'll do if they don't get it. Now,
Negotiations for release of the hostages have continued throughout the day.
On the phone, I talked with the leader, Frank Gorham. He's a 25-year-old man faced with at least 50 years in prison, and he talked like it. He was bitter and he was frustrated, but he was rational. He told me that he is a victim of a racist, inhumane society, and he wants out of it, and that's all he wants, nothing less. Today, he demonstrated his commitment to that when he told federal officials that he would die, and so would a few others, if he were not given safe passage to either Africa or to Red China. That's the way it is right now.
Authorities said that Jones and Gorham were the leaders of an escape attempt at the District of Columbia jail 2 years ago.
Home is where the needle marks. Tried to heal my broken heart, and it might not be such a bad idea if I never went home again, home again. Home.
Speaking of armed robbery, the 1970s in D.C. saw more reported robberies than the 80s, 90s, and the decade that came before the 70s. Common folks, hustlers, crap tables, loan offices, and banks, no one was safe from getting robbed. Even the daughter of the ex-deputy mayor for the city at the time was involved in the failed loan office robbery attempt in Northwest that left an officer dead on the scene.
Didn't I treat you right now? Didn't I do the best I could?
And in 1974, another officer, Gail Cobb, died in a bank robbery attempt.
Policewoman Gail Cobb was killed during a bank robbery. The FBI said she was the first woman police officer to be killed in the line of duty. More on the story from Bernard Kalb.
The first suspect had already been apprehended, but not before he had pulled his gun and fired. Holding Officer Cobb's young son, her sister talked about the slain policewoman.
Gail really wanted to do it. Gail would do it because she was very determined. So if she would set her goals and she would achieve them.
It was said that 8 people played a role in the robbery attempt that led to the unfortunate end of Gail Cobb. She was the first female officer to lose her life while on duty, the first in D.C. and the first in the country, period. Gail was born and raised near 14th and D Streets Northeast in a row home. Her parents met at Cardozo High School and later had Gail in 1950. So originally she wanted to become a fashion designer but settled for a job as a long-distance operator. She had a son at 19 and was raising him as a single mother. Eventually, she applied for a job with MPD in October 1973. So they arrested 8 total people in connection with the attempt, including the gunman and another guy named John Dortch, pictured here, who was one of the main guys planning the robbery. And it's documented that there was claims of him wanting to use the robbery money to start an organization called New Nation in D.C. for the sole purpose of funding black-owned businesses. He ended up serving 15 years in prison. And honestly, not making no excuses for what happened. Someone lost their life, but he's prime example of how to learn from your mistakes and turn your life around, because after all that, the man studied law, got out, went to law school in the city, passed the bar, went on to work for a law firm, and the rest was history. Again, not to make excuses, but when he found out a woman died in that robbery attempt, he turned himself in. Many guys were out there on the same mission. It's just a testament to that period in time, the golden age of armed robbery. Even the well-known street figures from the city, like I mentioned before in the Carl Kelly video, they all had robbery on their jacket.
Like a person needs a soul, like the winter needs the cold. Like a baby needs to cry,
Shortly after daybreak, one prisoner stabbed another, and a group of 100 tried to rush the guard.
You know, it's another world out there. It's people out there. It's freedom behind that wall and stuff like that.
Willie Strickland, a.k.a. Strick, ran the streets of D.C. since his teen years in the 60s. He had run-ins with the law and spent time in and out of correctional facilities, with his most longest time spent in being 50 years. Strick is one of the men who a lot of dudes got a lot of respect for and credit him for being a stand-up man, even showing younger homies how to move in the federal system, leading by example. Strick was super outspoken, and he's alive now, alive and free. And I even talked to his sister once on the phone, but he was busy at the time. But eventually, I plan to reach back out to either get him on the channel to discuss his life and affairs in D.C. during his prime, or maybe to talk off here.
You know, I fight back. You know, if somebody die in the course of me fighting back, you know, what about me? You know, I got one eye. Somebody shot me at point blank range, shot my eye out.
Even though the 1970s didn't reach the crazy homicide rate of the late 80s, early 90s, it did see some of the worst kinds of homicides. One in particular that I mentioned covering on a Navy Yard video, the Hanafi Muslim Massacre.
You are asking that those responsible for the deaths or who killed your children be brought to the B'nai B'rith building.
And the ones that killed Malcolm.
And the ones that killed Malcolm.
That's right. I want them.
And you're asking for the $750?
I want them. And the $750. And be sure you make on the radio that I've turned down millions of dollars, so it's not the $750, but this dog-ass Judge Braben, he hold me in contempt of court because I charged the murderers that murder my babies. Now, what do you think about that? And you think I'm going to roll over and play dead? What do you think I am? Some kind of jokester? I take my face serious.
It happened at 7700 16th Street Northwest, 1973. The Hanafi movement started after the founder, Hamas, left the Nation of Islam to start his own group, taking on the name Hanafi, meaning rightly guided, and later Hamas moved to D.C. in 1971. Basketball superstar Lou Alcindor was converted to Islam and took on the name we all know, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He supported the Hanafi by purchasing and donating a mansion at 7700 16th Street Northwest, which became the headquarters for the movement. But outside of that, there was beef between the Hanafi and the Nation of Islam. The leader, Hamas, called out Elijah Muhammad in 1972 in an open letter calling him a liar and pretty much attacked his teachings. Some people didn't take kindly to it. A year later, members of the Black Mafia from Philadelphia who were allegedly tied to the Nation of Islam made their way to D.C. and went straight to the headquarters, the House of the Hanafi, to take out the leader, Hamas, on January 18, 1973. But he wasn't even home. His family was, though. His wife and children, 2 adult males, and a child were shot and taken out by these guys. 4 other children, ranging in age from 9 days to 10 years old, were drowned.
We're dealing with brutal murders. A baby 9 days old. Most people are afraid to hold a baby that young. But here you got somebody that took that baby in their arms and drowned it. Khalifa Hamas Abdul Khalis lost his 9-day-old to 22 months, and his daughters, 6 times shot in the head. These is fiends, man. So it ain't so much about getting individuals. We talking about getting the essence of that product that would do that.
This is by far probably the worst homicide case I ever heard of taking place on DC soil because of the children, especially the baby that was only 9 days old. Only the wife and daughter survived the attack. Hamas's daughter was hit with 6 shots and was left with permanent brain damage. According to the report, the daughter was taken upstairs in the house by the killers and was forced to kneel in the closet, and that's when they shot her in the head. But after realizing she didn't perish, they shot her 2 more times in the head and she lay still, but luckily she survived. 9 victims, 7 bodies, 5 children, at the hands of members of the Philadelphia Black Mafia. Hamas was about ready to crash out later after the men were all captured and charged, specifically due to the outcome in court. 6 men in total. 5 of the alleged murderers were found guilty. 1 of them walked free. The scary part was the distance so-called religious men were prepared to go to monopolize the message or the movement, and to instill fear from the higher-ups on the streets to lower-level prisoners behind the wall. The vibe was on some street shit, and it gets deeper. One of the men, named James Price, originally agreed to become an informant, cooperating fully with the prosecutor. They put him in the witness protection program, and in return, he received some death threats in the process. Coincidentally, later Louis Farrakhan did a radio broadcast, a speech that said, "Let this be a warning to the opponents of Muhammad. Let this be a warning to those of you who will be used as an instrument of a wicked government against our rise. Be careful, because when the government is tired of using you, they're going to dump you back into the laps of your people. And although Elijah Muhammad is a merciful man and will say, 'Come in,' and forgive you, yet in the ranks of black people today, there are younger men and women rising up who have no forgiveness in them for traitors and stool pigeons, and they will execute you as soon as your identity is known. Be careful, because nothing shall prevent the rise of the Messiah, the Nation of Islam, and the black man the world over." Wow. It don't get no more direct than that. Some time after the speech, James was called on to take the stand in the Hanafi murder case. It was said that he got up on the stand to become a protege of the state and testify. But at the last minute, right then and there, he refused to talk, which canceled whatever agreement that was made. At that moment, a weight was probably lifted off his shoulder, even though he had already given information that convicted 5 people. But James still wasn't safe. He had to be held accountable from a legality standpoint. Behind the prison walls he went, straight to Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. And in December 1974, he was found murdered in his cell. He was beaten and strangled with shoelaces, hanging from a heat vent, violated, paid in full. Whatever differences the Hanafi and the nation had, whether if it was solely words of disrespect or religious disagreements, neither was worth the lives of a man's family, little children, a newborn baby. Even if it was a conspiracy or a robbery attempt, as some people say, it don't matter. Women and children should have been off limits. They brought the murder shit to the city to kill off a man's entire legacy, his family. The only thing we leave behind, a devastating ending for the parties involved though. By 1977, Hamas led what was called a siege, where he and some other guys took over 100+ hostages in D.C. After the vicious murder attack on his family, upset about the court outcome and the men who murdered his folks, the Hanafi Muslim crew stormed 3 buildings with guns in hand. Mayor for life, Marion Barry, was present and ended up getting shot in that situation, but of course, he survived. 2 other hostages were shot. One of them was killed. Another male died later. They held the hostages for 36 hours until eventually Hamas gave up and turned itself over to the feds. He was tried and convicted and received a sentence of 21 to 120 years. He passed away in 2003 in prison at Butner in North Carolina. The Muslim wars of the 70s made national headlines and spilled on the D.C. soil, adding another chapter in the history books of the streets, the Underworld. From the same struggle and resistance, a new era was brewing, a new golden era. The Young Dynamos formed a band in the mid-70s. A young kid named Anthony from Southeast carrying a trumpet in his hand joined them later. Chuck founded the city's signature sound. Marion Barry became mayor in 1979, and his plan to provide the youth with summer jobs became legendary and stamped them in the people's history books. Thanks for watching, man. Check out the Lil Benny video next.
A junkie walking through the twilight. I'm on my way home. I left 3 days ago, but no one seems to know I'm gone. Home is where the hatred is. Home is filled with pain. such a bad idea if I never